So I'm waiting to take the walking tour, which is in about another hour and a quarter from now. And we start at the Parliament House, which is 32. The house, that dark rectangular building that has like a tower on this back right side. It's its back. I'm in the little garden in there now. And the Borg Hotel is number 7, just to orientate you. I doubt there's monumental architecture like this in Iceland to any great degree. This is the entrance into the pretty back of the Parliament. So this is the original Parliament building, and I am assuming you approached from the front on the other side. In its day, probably pretty impressive. It's a pretty building anyway, with a very lovely garden. Obviously a place for people to come and seek refuge. Here, a monument. It's on a very mossy, encrusted, rocky little pinnacle that they've created for it. Don't know what it is or who it is. Few countries bother themselves explaining their monuments to tourists. I'm guessing that it now houses administrative offices. I'm thinking that that section over there may be the police and all of that kind of infrastructure in that newer building which is attached to it. An 1847 structure. We won't find very old structures in this country. Now at the front of the Parliament building, which would have stood alone, i.e. obviously without this newer structure. But we'll pan up the street just to look at some of the buildings. Notice the mix of what looks like an older classic design, at least for Iceland, and the modern interstice building, if you will. Behind us is this park that we'll go take a look at, and a large rock here. And this is called the Black Cone, a monument to civil disobedience. Read this. When the government violates the rights of the people, insurrection is for the people and for each portion of the people, the most sacred of rights and the most indispensable of duties. Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, 1793. So you wonder if they took it from Tom. There probably was the town center, or the town square. I think it's still called that in the day. I have no idea what this is, but I'm sure I'll learn a little bit later. It's always interesting to look at the monumental art in countries, in cities, that try to express the philosophical, usually political turmoils that it's endured. So this is a monument to John Sigurðsson, leader of Iceland's independence movement from the Danes. Architecture on the opposite side of the square. Some of the local. You can figure out what it is. Probably an early photo of this square, or at least of the town that was here. I think the latter. An even earlier photograph. I'd swear when I walked by those people about 50 feet away from them, I could smell the booze. Seriously. In olden times, Reykjavik was simply a farm called the East Field. Interesting, this area that used to be a turf field, but was destroyed because they kept taking the turf away to use. It became simply an unused, disreputable bog. And in the 19th century, it served as a campsite for countrymen visiting this major city or town, but also for early tourists. Finally, in 1875, after the Danish had donated a statue in honor of an important person, they decided to fence this area and restore it. In 1930, the fence was removed, opening the square. 31, the statue was moved to another park to make room for the statue we saw earlier of John Sickerson, which now is the centerpiece. In the 20th century, it oftentimes became a skating rink during the winter time. But most of the 20th century, it has served as a center for protests. This building, I do not know its function, but I suspect it's a building dedicated to marine commerce, or commerce in general. We'll take a slow pan of this mural, which looks like it's made from individual tiles, evidencing what look like the stacks, or the sail stacks, masts of various kinds of ships, perhaps over time. One of the small discrete symbols, don't know what it represents. It looks like a geode. Closer view of the sun, of course, and I think it's a setting sun if this direction is west, which I believe it is, more or less. There's another such icon up there, which seems to be a pivot point for these lines. What they represent, I don't know, whether they're cranes, whether they represent woolen mills, I don't know. And certainly don't have a clue what these circles. So far I've seen two such statues. One was that pair. In each case, it's a dejected, forlorn, emaciated look. I don't understand. Maybe I'll learn on the tour. Ever since Athens, I love the wall art. It's just one of the older parts of Reykjavik. Older buildings starting to rust out, and this is not fiberglass, it is metal. Corrugated steel, whatever you want to call it. So these date to 1850, but it is interesting to wonder. This one looks like wood, whether it's been resided or not. See, this looks like wood, and I think that's what that is. I'm now in one of my most favorite contexts, Lost, somewhere in Reykjavik. Interesting. French architecture, simulated, but with certainly a modern flourish on the left. Here, an older looking home once had an intent to embellish itself with that little balcony. Here's an extensive remodeling of this older building. You can see they've redone all the metal